Welcome everybody, good evening. My name is David Cook. I'm the ACS Vice President for Academic Boards, and I'm delighted to welcome you today to the fourth of our new series, our Think Tank series. And to tell you a little bit about this, this is an inclusive event. Anyone who takes part tonight is automatically considered to have been a contributor to our Think Tank group. Welcome. This is where we talk on difficult topics. We touch on the hard stuff, the things that keep us awake at night. And tonight's event is looking at the topic of facial recognition, identity management versus dystopian nightmare. So before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge two things. Firstly, the traditional custodians of the land that we're meeting on. In this case, this is the Ngunnawal people, and I wish to acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contribution that they make to the life of this city and this region. And I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging in whatever part of Australia that you may find yourself tonight. The second part is to acknowledge diversity. We have at the ACS what we call the ACS Diversity Pledge, where we see the value in welcoming diversity, and we look towards finding a cross-section of people from all pathways, all identities, and all individual views and thoughts. You are most welcome. ACS Think Tank is about the wicked and intractable problems, the hard stuff. And we do this in an open town hall setting. Tonight we have members in the audience, and also we have a large number of people, several hundreds of people who are online. All of you are welcome, your views are welcome, and your opinions are important to the ACS. One of the things we do is we like to get you involved up and early in terms of how we look at future events. This is our last Think Tank for this year, but we have events coming up in 2023. And one of the things we're doing is we use a particular form where you can register your preference for different kinds of topics. So tonight you can register on what we call team forms. And for those of you who are virtually attending, or those of you who are online, you can click on a link that's in the chat on your Teams. And for those of you who are here in person, we have a QR code that will appear on the screen, and you can scan that and you can make your choices in terms of those things. So we've got a number of topics which you can look at. The sorts of topics I think that you get to choose between tonight are things such as AI-generated creative content, how much automation is too much automation, crypto, future currency or global problems, should people be taught to code, those sorts of things. There'll be a number of choices. We'd like you to tell us what you'd like to have as one of our next topics. All right. So in order to unpack these, we're going to go to our panel. We have a panel of people. We have the notion that what we do here transfers in terms of passing on information to the various mechanisms that we have at the ACS. We have various technical bodies, various groups, advisors and people, and we're constantly looking for new information, new perspectives, making sure that we're on the right track and making sure that we're filling the gaps in what we do or don't represent across the RCT profession. So in terms of tonight, we're looking at placing identity management at the front of the technology conversation. Identity software is important and it is everywhere. And this evening, we want to call out the gaps. We want to look to fix exclusion and constraints. So with that, we chose the topic, facial recognition, identity management versus dystopian nightmare. We're looking about whether it's exciting or whether it's terrifying, because it's both. And it's already become a mainstream technology, seemingly without us realizing what we're doing. It's embedded on smartphones. It's used by millions of people to activate phones. It's used at airports, passport control, nightclubs, casinos. It is literally ubiquitous, and we face it every single day. So to help us unpack this tonight, I'd like to introduce our panel. We're especially lucky to be joined this evening by a panel of experts. Firstly, I'd like to introduce you to Ms. Kavita Kawal. She's the Assistant Secretary for Identity and Biometrics and the Futures Branch for the Digital and Technology Policy Division at the Department of Home Affairs. Welcome, Kavita. I'd also like to, on the far side of me, introduce Chris Radbone. Chris is the South Australian Branch Chair. He is a champion of data management, especially in health. and he is soon to become, in 2023, the National Treasurer of the Australian Computer Society. Please make welcome Chris Radbone. And I have sitting in between Diana Gibbs. Diana is a cybersecurity expert. She has, and it's hard to believe, a decades-long set of experiences in critical incident management, IT governance. She's managed major delivery programs and national security systems. Please make welcome Diana. And then joining us online, we have an online special panelist who's going to join us from New South Wales. We have Kimberly Weatherall. She is Professor of Law at the University of Sydney Law School. Welcome to you, Kimberly. All right, so let's get into it. Some important details. Firstly, tonight is going to be recorded. So we want your members, and we will put those nuggets, those wonderful pieces of information, we will put them out so that people can watch them in the future. You'll be able to see that on YouTube. You'll see links coming up in future forums. Stay tuned to Information Age to find out more information. Secondly, we encourage the debate that goes on here. We want your questions. We want to hear what bugs you. Please ask your questions, but we ask that you remain respectful at all times. So please, if you're online, we'd ask that you stay on mute. Please don't unmute yourself or start up a chainsaw in the background, because it will tend to distract from the overall conversation of what we're doing. And thirdly, for those of you who are the strong silent types among us, any formalised questions and comments you can submit if you want via our virtual audience through the Q&A function, which is on Teams, and we'll review that. We'll have various moments where we'll cross to that and look at some of the questions that have come up. So let's kick things off with our first question for tonight. And I'm going to ask for someone from the audience. He's a well-known Canberra, a respected ACS gentleman by the name of Tom Worthington. Tom, what's your first question?
Thank you. Bunnings and Kmart have been looking at using facial recognition of customers who walk through the door. Governments have the capability to do this, as well as large corporations. Do they have the right to do this without the permission of the customers, citizens? Should they?
I'm going to start by putting this to Kavita. What are your thoughts about this?
Thank you for the question. So I look after identity and biometrics policy in the Department of Home Affairs. Our focus is on identity security primarily, and obviously use of biometrics is critical for identity management, critical for identity security as well. The legislation that governs the use of biometrics primarily is the Privacy Act. For us in the Department of Home Affairs, it's also the Migration Act and the Citizenship Act. And this looks at, particularly the Privacy Act, the collection, use and disclosure of information. And biometrics or facial recognition is your face is treated as a biometric. When it comes specifically to facial recognition, there have been a number of reports and legislation that's been put up by government as well in this area. So just last year we had the former Human Rights Commissioner put out a report around AI and in the context of human rights. That report recommended a moratorium on the use of facial recognition until we had legislation in place. It is something that the department certainly supports, and I was a member of the expert reference group that informed the report. We've also looked at putting, as I mentioned, legislation up, and this was our face matching service. It was tabled in Parliament, referred to the Parliamentary Joint Committee for Intelligence and Security, and in that, the feedback that was provided was it needed greater provisions around oversight and transparency. So from our perspective, there is legislation that governs it, but it goes back to use of your facial image, of the facial recognition technologies as well, with and without consent of people. And if you look at the Privacy Act, it is quite clear about the information being collected, for what it, and to be used for what it has been collected for. With our legislation, a significant part of it is to enable the one-to-one matching, which is very much confirming I'm saying who I am based on my driver's license or based on my passport. That is the non-contentious part of the bill, and that will certainly allow people to have that control, choosing to opt in as well. The one-to-many part of the legislation, which is primarily for law enforcement and national security use, that has been the more controversial part of the bill. And again, from a departmental perspective, it does need to have the broader consultation around what is appropriate ethical use of biometrics. When is it okay for governments to use biometrics without somebody's consent? In what circumstances would we do that? It is a great capability for an individual from a service delivery perspective, for disadvantaged communities as well in some cases. And it is a great tool for national security and law enforcement purposes as well, but it needs to come with the appropriate legislation, oversight, transparency, and controls as well.
I'm wondering what you're thinking about this, Deanna. Do you have any thoughts on that? There you go. Sorry about that, folks.
Okay. So I actually work for IBM. So while all of the opinions today are my own, I can comment on the policy that we have within IBM. In and around 2020, IBM actually made a decision that it ethically would withdraw from facial recognition for one-to-many. That the position is that there needs to be precision regulation, that there may well be particular use cases where that might be appropriate, but that there needs to be that regulatory framework that sits around the use, and it needs to be very tailored to particular circumstances. And, you know, from a personal perspective, that's something I would wholeheartedly agree with in this case.
Great. I'm going to jump to another question, and I'm going to go to someone online who's sent us a message. This is Belinda Morgan from Port Hedland asks this question. Recently, the hacks on Optus and Medibank have brought into focus the practice of organisations to collect and store excessive customer information. What laws are in place that specifically regulate what biometric information can be collected, and how is it stored? Do these need to be rethought considering new technology capabilities such as mass surveillance facial recognition? What would be the implications? I'm going to turn to our New South Wales panellist who's online. I'm hoping you can join us. Kimberly Weatherall, welcome to the think tank. What do you think about this question?
Good question. Just confirming that you can hear me, yes?
Yes, we've got
good.
you.
All right. Well, Kavita's already given us a quick summary of what the law is that applies here, which is the Privacy Act. It's the Privacy Act that governs collection of this sort of information at the moment. That's actually, by the way, one of our problems in relation to facial recognition, which is that we are trying to deal with this technology under a law that's not designed for the purpose. The Privacy Act, despite its name, is really a data protection act. It's about the control and, you know, control around the collection and use of data, all sorts of data. The problem with trying to use that in relation to facial recognition is that the Privacy Act was never designed to address the fundamental right to privacy, which is broader than just data protection. So the Act was never designed to really address questions around surveillance, which is what this is, right? The use by Kmart or Bunnings is a surveillance use of biometric data. And you know, we need different laws for that. Which is why we actually need recognition of a broader right to privacy. where we could talk about, what sort of use of this kind of technology is reasonable, what kind of state do we want to live in? Do we want to live somewhere where your identity can be checked every building you go into? Is that a reasonable use? Is that a not reasonable use? So, my initial response to that, do we need a review of the law? Yes, we do. As Kavita has recognised, as Deanna has recognised, we do need laws that deal specifically with biometrics, not just facial recognition, by the way, biometrics more generally. So the kinds of technology that relate to your personal features and that can identify you and that is unique to you. And that could be your face, it could be your iris, it could be your gait, it could be other things. So we do need laws specifically around that. We also need, and we are in fact in the middle of a review of our Data Protection Act, which is the Privacy Act. So there's a review going on about that at the moment that, we're expecting perhaps some sort of result out of that, out of the Attorney General's Department by the end of the year is the time frame we've been given for that. So that will address maybe another set of questions which Belinda has raised, which is that, do we want companies collecting and keeping this amount of data? This kind of data. One of the things the Privacy Act does is it distinguishes between sensitive information and other personal information. Now, biometrics is by definition sensitive information, and by legislative definition, because it's unique to us, it's very personal. And there are, at the moment in the Act, higher rules around that. So if you want to collect this sort of information, if you want to use it, you actually do need consent. And that's one of the questions being raised in the Kmart Bunnings type example raised earlier, which is if you put a little sign off somewhere next to the entrance that maybe someone might see or maybe they won't, and then they walk in, is that, you say, oh, if you walk in, you're consenting to use of facial recognition, is that sufficient consent? Spoiler alert, no, but that's under investigation by the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner at the moment, as I understand. And then the other question that's raised, particularly by the Medibank and Optus type scenarios, but is also very immediate and important in relation to biometric data, is, do we want firms to be keeping this kind of data, right? Or do we want to more affirmatively require companies to delete data once they no longer need it? If they've used it to identify you initially, do they need to keep it forever? Probably not. Do we need more affirmatively? There are principles in our law that say if you don't need information anymore, you should delete it or anonymise it. But do we need to make sure that firms are really doing that? So short answer, yes, absolutely, we need law reform. We need law reform more generally around biometrics. We need law reform to actually affirm our fundamental right to privacy, to start to deal with some of these questions around surveillance. And we need to review our data protection laws, particularly around things like minimising and deleting data. A lot of work to do.
Okay, Kimberly, thank you for that. I want to ask Chris. Chris, you've had more to do with data collection than you've had hot breakfasts. It's fair to say, and you've particularly worked in health, so you would have views about data retention and data usage. Where does it sit from your perspective?
If we take the legal constraints, each jurisdiction in Australia generally has almost different approaches. So that's actually a problem for Australia. We've heard the Commonwealth perspective around home security, and we all like to use our digital passports to, fly through the international terminal and all that. And so we're getting good services from the use of this technology. But then if you go into the healthcare space, so in South Australia, where I'm based, hospital records need to be kept for 120 years. Now, if that's not the same in other jurisdictions, that's just by the way. We then deal with younger people who are under 18, and some of their records need to be kept 7 years after they've got to 18 years of age. And so there's a separate lot of work around after the records have been held for 7 years, they can be removed, except for that exception around younger people. So this issue is very complex in relation to the jurisdictional legal pieces that are trying to play in this part. And so my fundamental question around the benefits of this technology is that we choose to use some of these services. And that's partly the question. So if I circle back to Tom's question, Bunnings were looking to manage difficult customers that had come in either with weapons into the premises and threatened staff and assaulted staff. So it was a public safety type mindset. The question is, there's no legal framework that's sufficient to manage the sort of life cycle of this sort of matter and how it gets, and the term would be independently audited. So whether the use is appropriate, whether it's not appropriate. I've already heard the consent from Kimberly, which in the health domain, there's a long track record consenting for your records to be used for a purpose. So you sit in front of the doctor and you ask the doctor for a service, there's an obligation around the disclosure and access to records included in that transaction. Human research ethics committees around the secondary use, if you want that term, of people's health information and other records, can extinguish an individual's right to privacy by saying that the greater good for the wider community excuses or absolves your right to personal privacy. So, the obligation then is a community-wide benefit, personal privacy. So, interesting space, because effective in this is those benefits flowing, personal services that we're getting access to, giving us a better life, digital. That issue of consent and being implicit, other than implied or otherwise.
Thanks, Chris. And Kavita, what are you thinking about this?
Thank you. What I would like to say is the issues raised by my colleagues on the panel, they are things that we think about every day. It's really interesting to hear very different perspectives. So my team has been leading the incident management response to Medibank and Optus. Optus turned out to be a significant data breach, which impacted on about 9.8 million Australians. So identity security has certainly been a conversation in many discussions inside and out of government as well. But one of the things that we're now seriously considering is having biometrically anchored identities, which reduces the need to store those paper documents. But we need to have the architecture to support that as well. So MyGovID is one example where we've started rolling out face verification to create a tax file number, and that can now be done almost instantaneously, as opposed to the almost 28 days that it used to take, and also a visit to a physical shop front as well. But as unfortunate as Optus and Medibank were, it did identify that we can do data management, privacy, much better, particularly with some of the services that we have. So my department, for example, runs the document verification service, where if that is used, all you need to do is keep the transaction number and the yes or no to confirm that the person says who they are or not. That reduces the risk of major data breaches. So again, I think there's a lot of positives in the use of biometrics, but also it needs to have the right governance arrangements in place.
Okay, so we've got a couple of other things. I'm going to check in with what we call our car park now, and we're going to have a look, because here's where we can see some of the other questions that have come in from people who are online. I'm going to read out a few. So we've got from Krishna, what if we use facial recognition on every CCTV camera so we can track the criminal activities as well as positive aspects happening in the world? Deanna, you're a cybersecurity expert. What do you think about that?
I guess I have a number of concerns about that, and this I see as a particularly complex issue. From a law enforcement perspective, I can certainly see instances where it is of immense value to be accessing those CCTV cameras in the instance of a terrorist attack, with an Amber Alert where a child has been kidnapped. Things that we could legitimately say have a societal benefit immediately spring out as valuable. My concern is that when you take that to a perspective like we see in some nations, where there's the social credit approach that the Chinese government has made, if we have very firm structures around what circumstances those cameras might be used, then perhaps I might have an appetite. But my broader concern is that we don't have a clearly established social contract. We don't necessarily have agreement on what is appropriate, and I don't think that's been explored sufficiently. So without using the existing mechanisms like a court order in a particular circumstance, I can't necessarily see that we would be in a position. I also would have some genuine personal concerns. I spent a long time working in the public sector. I do know what it's like to have a minister walk in and say, yesterday we did facilitation, today we do this. There are so many elements that can be influenced by changes in our society that can drive unanticipated consequences. I do think there are a range of positive social benefits to being able to use facial recognition. I can certainly say that authenticating as I go through a gate made my trip in and out of the country extraordinarily easy. As somebody who got hacked in the Optus hack, it would have made me much more comfortable to actually be able to do something other than show my driver's license up to my face over a Teams meeting with my vendor when I refinanced. There are circumstances where I think there's immense social benefit. If we look at dementia sufferers, I'm one of the sandwich generation. I'm having to consider how I manage care remotely, what happens with some of our older generation, and as that grows, I can see the benefit of facial recognition as a mechanism for social good. But I think we're a long way from that. I think we definitely need that framework around it, and that we need to explore things like as new architectures technically are becoming available that allow things like citizen-held data that can be used with data in government. I think that there's more opportunity for being able to do these things safely. But on the surface of it, what if we use it for tracking criminal activities? Who decides who's a criminal today?
Great point, Anna. I want to take this a little bit further because.
Can I just add to that?
Yeah, jump in, Kimberly, please.
Which is, I'm in 100% agreement there. One of the notable things about, say, the discussion in the EU looking at the sort of real-time biometric identification is that, when they talked about it, they talked about effectively allowing it only for identifying victims or suspects of serious offences or to prevent imminent threat to life or physical safety. And it's those sorts of limits that you need to look at. But can I emphasise that when we talk about serious crime, we really need to be very clear about what we're talking about. There are areas in Australian law where serious crime is defined as anything that's punishable by a jail term of 4 years or more, or 5 years or more. And there's an awful lot of crimes that you might be surprised to learn have a potential jail term of 5 years or more. They include things like copyright infringement, you know, in my other life as an intellectual property lawyer. So, you know, when we say serious crimes, we need to be pretty specific about what kinds of things actually count as serious crimes. Are we talking about terrorists and murderers only, or are we starting to look at a more broad set of things where there is a big jail term, which could be surprising to a lot of people?
Thanks, Kimberly. That issue of trust is becoming central to this conversation. And as you say, questions of the public good, they seem to strike a chord. But if we use the same facial recognition to follow AFL umpires on the way out to the car park so they can get home, that might be an abuse of that use, perhaps. But I might just Chris, you might have thoughts about this, not about the AFL umpires, of course. That's another part of Chris's life. But I'm interested to know if you've got any thoughts about this, particularly on this issue of trust and the difference between what's good and what's not, you know, the wrong use of facial recognition.
So the question is, who do we trust? So that's the question. And so we do get our photo ID for our driver's license given to our state motor vehicle department. And we do have a national driver's license database that's in existence, I think from 2017. So it's quite mature in the sense of what we're talking about. So the question is, have we specifically as a consumer consented to that being the case? Probably not. We've trusted that the government agencies are the right people to look after that information and have rules and processes. We've already heard earlier that there's limited legal coverage on this matter. So the question of trust is a really interesting one, and whether the issue that then branches from government to non-government sector, and how do we generate the same level of trust? And so, you know, do I trust Google and Amazon with all of my personal information, or Apple, you know, that sort of thing? And that's a good question. And I know in this specifics, Facebook have, you know, withdrawn from their approach to take on this biometrics work at the moment. They've seen it as too hot a potato to tackle. But the question we've got is, you know, as a digitally enabled society, we're all looking forward to these services. So the demand is only going one way, and the dementia example is quite prevalent. For my day job, I do look after people with dementia who go wandering, and working with the WA police at this point, and going national, is this idea of how do you look after people who may not have a digital you know, monitor around their neck. They may not be taking their phone with them so they could be pinged off the telecommunications network. So this issue of how do we actually keep people safe? But is it then we use the public or the, you know, the CCTV network to track someone who's gone wandering? That's the social good and the social license to do that. We're a long way from there.
Okay, we're going to put a pin in that one. We'll come back to that one because we're on the clock and I want to get to the next few questions. Deanna, I'll give you a shot. But before we do that, I've got a question here from the audience, and I'm going to ask Mohammed. If you're here, Mohammed, who has worked with me today, he is the chair of our Blockchains Technology Committee. Welcome to Canberra. And what's your question?
The good applications of facial recognition, and you mentioned some of the cases. The question is, there are countless stories around us about the bad side of it, and you know, that we are getting into that squared into that frame of organizations trying to leverage, you know, some political or financial outcomes. The question is, can these social benefits, you know, sustain that kind of resentment and anger around, you know, the bad side, the darker side of the facial recognition? Can that benefit sustain the dark side of it?
Deanna, can you help us out here?
I think there may well come a time where it can. I think there are a number of use cases that are clearly in the social good. And I do think that as technology continues to improve, as I kind of flagged earlier, some of the things that I'm seeing come through are things like citizen-held data, where we give permission to share and verify at particular times and withdraw that in concert with appropriate authentication bodies. For those circumstances, I can see authentication more broadly becoming safer. I can see if we can move to a point where we have trust then in our institutions, in our authentication authorities, and in the use of that data, and that we control it, then we perhaps will be less distrusting of the misuse. I think we've been confronted recently with all of the significant data breaches that has shown us that this is an area that perhaps industries and government and individuals haven't really taken as seriously as they should. Perhaps there will be a world where we feel more comfortable that in fact that is the case, but it does need that social license. It does need trust in institutions. It needs the regulatory framework, and it needs our confidence that those regulatory frameworks are effective, not simply a rule that anyone can go and break if they choose. So it's a suite of measures.
I'm just wondering, Kavita, is this an issue for policy? Is it about better policy in this area?
Policy needs to be informed by community consultation. And I think there is definitely a need to have a broader conversation around the use of facial recognition. What's acceptable, what's not. And beyond that, it is about, as I've said before, when is it appropriate to use somebody's biometrics without their consent? What does ethical use of biometrics look like? And how can we be more transparent about the use of biometrics? And from a government perspective, transparency is a key thing for us, but also having the right oversight arrangements in place as well. Deanna's mentioned a few times the individual-centric, and that comes up in our conversations as well. But the other issue for us from a policy perspective is making sure that we've got alternatives as well. It's a great technology, but when we talk to our counterparts in the Northern Territory government, for example, they'll tell us about remote communities, the connection issues that they have, and communities where they do not have sufficient identity documents to even apply for a passport. So there's great benefits, and it can certainly be a tool for social improvement, for social good, but I think there's quite a bit of work to be done before we get to that point.
Kimberly, I want to just ask if you can jump in on the spot on this, because we seem to be talking about a one-size-fits-all in a domain where we've got too many different sizes and they don't fit. So from a legal perspective, that sounds like a nightmare. What are your thoughts, Kimberly?
Terrific question.
I think you're on. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I was. Now I'm not. Terrific question. Not least because I was actually sitting here listening to the conversation and thinking, it would be nice to make sure that we distinguish carefully between, facial identification, kind of one-to-many style, facial verification, one-to-one style, and then other kinds of facial analysis, things where you're drawing inferences from facial data, something about your emotional state or behavioural state, or your intention or demographics, like these are different questions. And so it's funny because when we talk about, facial recognition is great because we get all these convenient services and e-passports and things like that. You're like, yes, but that's verification, and that's different from one-to-many, someone's walking into a store and I work out who they are, or, you know, someone's in a protest and there are cameras that can identify them afterwards if, you know, they bopped a policeman on the head. So there are these distinctions that do need to be drawn between these different kinds of things. And when we're having this conversation, I think it's important to keep that in mind really carefully. As for the broader question around a one-size-fits-all, I mean, I don't think anyone is suggesting that this could ever be one-size-fits-all. You know, if you look at some of the legal discussions that have been had, so you know, some people may be aware that Ed Santo's Human Technology Institute issued a kind of model law to think about, you know, as a proposal, as a starting point for a proposal around how would we regulate this kind of technology. And, you know, the centre of that proposed model law is the kind of risk system where you go through a human rights impact assessment. You know, you look at what human rights are at risk in relation to this use of this technology.
Yeah, I'm going to report the damage and we'll send someone.
Sorry, someone's not on mute. So you have the, you know, the impact assessment, and then you look at, you know, whether the mitigations are in place and what sort of mitigations you need and what sort of oversight you need and what kinds of, you know, and whether the use is even proportionate given those impacts, you know, and assessing them against the benefits. So there are ways that you can write regulation such that you allow for the nuanced application in particular circumstances. Now, and you know, it's been clear in the conversation so far, there might be some distinctions we want to draw between what government can do and what private sector can do. Not least, you know, when you're talking about government use, you know, the idea of us being consenting to most of those activities is pretty imaginary. You know, we don't really get to consent as to how our driver's license material is used, right? That's not really a choice. We don't get a choice about what government is going to do with this kind of data. So you have to think about that differently. You know, government has a different kind of power over us. So short point, let's be careful what we're talking about. Let's recognise that there are different kinds of uses of this sort of technology, and be clear that the convenience of verification doesn't mean that we should have, you know, one-to-many facial recognition everywhere. Like, those two things are just too different. But also, let's create the legal framework that is going to enable us to make these nuanced decisions, but from a human rights perspective, with human rights built in from the start as the assessment, and with some sort of societal level transparency about those assessments that are being made, so that we can all have this dialogue and debate.
Thank you for that. I'm really glad that you talked about the human rights perspective, and trust is becoming central to this conversation as we go. I've got another question that's come in from someone online. This is from Brisbane. Joanna Hansen has asked a question: can facial recognition hurt democracy? Do we have the right to attend a public demonstration to support a cause without being individually highlighted? Does facial recognition make it harder to support a seemingly good cause? And would this impact others' willingness to stand alongside nurses seeking a pay rise, or gay and lesbian activists seeking diversity rights without fear of being publicly identified? I'm going to go to Chris for this. Chris, what are your thoughts? Kick us off.
Coming from Queensland, I sort of recall, now don't you worry about that, Joe Bjelke-Petersen and the laws that got passed in the Queensland government to stop street protests. So it just took me there. I'm sorry about that. But the issue we actually have is there's an elephant in the room here that we haven't discussed, and the accuracy of the actual identification is still significantly poor. So if you're not a white male, I might get a 99% accuracy rate, but that's not the case for other genders or other races. So the reality of the technology, it still has a long way to go. So if we then take that into the street march scenario or concern over people being identified, then I think we've sort of lost it somewhere, because I think we've, you know, people can stand there with high-powered photo, you know, just static photo and start tracking people's mobile phone numbers and all sorts of other, I'd argue, nefarious activities. But that's just to throw that to you, Dave. Sorry.
That's all right. Deanna, have you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I actually was going to flag earlier, we also need to be concerned about that algorithm bias. It's something that's very real. As you say, there are different response rates for different demographics, for different races, for different features, and there are biases that are actually potentially built into the algorithms. And probably a really simple way to describe that, there was an airline recently, I was watching some feeds through Twitter, where if you were female, you could not select doctor as your title. And if we look at that, it would simply have been that doctor was added to a list of attributes, because depending on your gender, you got as, you know, master and Mr. and Miss and Ms., and no one added doctor to the female table. And nobody who specified it specified doctor into the female table. And nobody who tested it clearly tested whether doctor appeared in the female table. And that really is clearly an example of that unconscious bias. Now, our algorithms are developed by developers. Somebody who specifies it, somebody who tests it, somebody who develops it. And each of us have our own implicit bias. That's unconscious. They didn't consciously choose to not allow doctor for women, just didn't enter their head because it was outside of their frame of reference or the thing they were focused on. We have algorithms that are initially developed by humans, and humans have bias, and those bias, if you don't correct for them, if you don't have particular structures in place for them, will continue to be in our facial matching algorithms. So while many in IT are trying to address algorithm bias, it is something that is still there and is real.
I'm going to check in with our car park, because we had some interesting comments there, and we'll have a look and see if on the car park we've got some different things. Let's go to the second one. There was from Paul. Tesla cars can send video clips to the USA. While the car owner consents to this, the people in the video clips do not. So this is a sort of a third party issue, once removed because it's gone to the United States. What are the applicable laws and regulations for this? Who would like to tick me off? Who would like to have a go at this one? This is a minefield question. Everyone's. Kimberly, I'm going to turn to you first.
Fair enough. Ask a law professor, why not? This sounds like the sort of thing I'd put in one of my law and technology exams. I mean, the basic point is that if you're talking about the collection of Australian information about Australians, then the Australian law does apply, right? But what the car owner consents, the people in the video clips do not. I suppose there'd be some live questions about whether this is personal information or not, whether people are identifiable, depending on the nature of the video clips, depending on the quality of the video. Yeah, I mean, this fundamentally, it does come under the Australian privacy law. If there are videos and they were collecting them and storing them and using that personal information, collecting and storing that personal information, there could be issues under Australian law. But yeah, tricky. Definitely a minefield.
Deanna?
So I have a thought, and it's because I work for a multinational. So if it bounces through Europe or they have operations in Europe, I believe that they would be subject to the GDPR.
Yep.
And the GDPR has an explicit consent requirement that encompasses not just personal information, but personally sensitive information. And depending on what they're collecting, it would reasonably be personal because it is identifiable potentially, and it has storage requirements. So I wonder if they'd be caught by the GDPR.
That's a great point. You know, it seems to me we've got a number of different jurisdictional issues here, not just in the US, not just in Europe, even just in Australia, we have different laws in different states in regards to facial recognition. It seems that we don't have one particular uniform way in which we're distinguishing between these different trust, usage, and security issues. Kavita, any thoughts?
I was just going to say, this happens to me all the time. I don't have Facebook, but I regularly appear in my sister's posts. But I think it is a very difficult question, a very good question, and certainly given us a lot to think about. I'm glad Kimberly and Deanna covered it from the legal perspective, but that's about all I have to say, David. Sorry.
No problem. All right. I'm going to go to another question now from the audience that we have here, and I'm going to invite our Director of the Technical Advisory Boards, Matthias Gartner. Matthias, what is your question?
Yes, I have to go back to the bias theme. The algorithms are not mature at the moment. They are still evolving. We all heard that, and that's all right. And the National Institute of Standards and Technology in the US just released a report just confirming that there is a strong bias in the algorithms at the moment about ethics, about gender and age and race. So what should be put in place? What safeguards should we implement before this stuff matures in that algorithm or in this technology that we avoid that problem?
Okay, Kimberly, throwing to you. Your thoughts on this?
I refer you to my earlier comments, which is that we actually quite urgently need like a broader right to privacy and laws that deal specifically with questions of surveillance. You know, to the extent that use of there's a use of a technology is going to involve discrimination, direct or indirect, against some people on the basis of some protected attribute, so race, gender, etc. There are possible applications of anti-discrimination law that would apply. You know, if choices are made and if people are substantially disadvantaged and it's not, there's not a justification or a reasonable justification for using that technology, and if the technology is bad enough, if the biases are bad enough, then I imagine you could at least try to litigate on that basis. It would be challenging. The Ed Santo's report on technology and human rights really highlighted that there's a lot of uncertainty about how discrimination laws intersect with the use of machine learning and artificial intelligence. And there's a lot of work going on right at the moment to try and tease that out better. But more broadly, one of the notable things for Australia is that if people were concerned that, say, the police had started to use a system for facial recognition and it was, you know, it was extremely prone to errors for people who are non-white, or perhaps women and the like. It is difficult in Australia to litigate that question, which is interesting because there's actually been active litigation in some other countries around this. So the Bridges case over in the UK, there was a lawsuit over police using facial recognition technology that was, you know, demonstrably biased. But it's difficult to bring that kind of litigation here because we don't have a Human Rights Act, because we don't have relevant laws that control this well. So we need some laws. We genuinely, one of the challenges Australia faces in relation to these kinds of technologies that implicate fundamental human rights is that in the absence of constitutional human rights or any, human rights legislation, we actually have to proactively legislate and decide how we want human rights to be balanced. And that's why this call is urgent. That's why the call to really deal with this is urgent.
Thanks, Kimberly. I will cross to Chris. Before I do it, I just want to shout out to some of our people online. We've got some fantastic questions that have been put in the car park. People who've put comments into the chat. Please keep all those comments coming. It's wonderful. For those of you who haven't yet lodged in some kind of preference, we have the Teams form. Don't forget that you can access that. So please do that if you're online. That would have been in the early part of the chat where you can see where you can go into that. Because we want to make some choices about moving forward for future think tanks. And for those of you who have put things onto the car park, because we won't get to all the questions, we're about running out of time, we're going to make sure that they get posted. You'll be able to see them again. We'll get further comments. This is not the end of a conversation. This is the beginning of one. Chris, some thoughts about this last troubling issue?
Yeah, I was picking up on Kavita's comment about the government, which is a good thing, being transparent and accountable and citizens being able to have assurance and trust that this is a good system. So that only can happen if there's some independent body there that's evaluating and reviewing and having that sense of authority over the activities that are going on, and be it the algorithms or the use or the access, just to make sure that that can occur. And that does require a legislative piece. So that's just...
All right. Kavita, last thoughts, and then we're going to...
Just on bias. So my team gave me some stats before coming in here. So it refers to a 2018 survey conducted by the Australian Institute of Criminology, which found that 49% of all Australian participants were extremely concerned about their privacy when using biometrics. And they were specifically concerned their biometrics may be collected without consent, or they will experience discrimination due to the inaccurate matching and system biases. And they were fearful that emerging AI technology could be coupled with biometrics recognition to perform automated and immediate identification of people en masse, which is I think, a very legitimate concern. And also in my job, I get to talk to a lot of industry representatives as well. And what's really interesting is they all have different views on how good the technology is and how theirs is the only one that, captures the biases or deals with the biases. But we still have a long way to go.
Okay, so we're in the wrap-up stage now. I think we're going to run out of time. Whilst I summarise, I'm going to come back to our panellists and I'm going to ask them to give me, in 5 words or less, what they think are the most important themes to concentrate to take this forward. So just to summarise, we've touched on a range of identity management challenges tonight. We've looked at facial recognition. We've looked at the issue of permission. We've looked at mass surveillance, issues of managed and stored biometric data. We've looked at facial recognition when it's used for the good of the society and where that sits. And we've considered the application of facial recognition versus people's right to democracy and the right to process. And we've considered the persecution of minorities and a number of other issues. So now I'd like to ask back to our panellists in 5 words or less. And I'll start with Kimberly. In 5 words or less, what are the key themes we need to think of in the future to progress this issue?
3 words: fundamental human rights.
Thank you, Kimberly. Chris, your thoughts?
Going for ethical social contracts.
Deanna?
Each case on its merits.
All right. Kavita?
Ethical choices, transparency, legislation, oversight.
Okay, so the question is, how did we go tonight? I'd love to hear more from your comments. Please keep those comments coming. Those of you who are online, put into the chat, tell us how we are going. We want to know if we're making a difference here. because this is a conversation you're going to hear a lot more about in the near future. Please stay tuned. You'll hear about things coming up in the information age for ACS members. You're going to hear this in the media no matter what. It's not going to go away. It's really important from us as professionals that we drive, I guess, some of the thought leadership on how we take this to the next level, because there's some tricky questions and some of the control over those questions is not obviously in our control. It sits, as we've already identified, with other people for other reasons in other countries and in other jurisdictions. So to wrap up, I'd like to thank our panelists for tonight, Kavita Kiwal, Chris Radbone, Kimberly Weatherall in New South Wales, and Deanna Gibbs. Could you please put your hands together for them? Before we finish, I do want to flick to our choice, because we were looking at what would be the next choice for this will be Think Tank number 6 coming up. By the way, Think Tank number 5, it will be in February of this year, and it will be cast from Perth, and that's going to be looking at skilled migration. That's going to be a hot topic. But the next one after that, we are going to look at is going to be, and I'm trying to see, it looks like it's crypto, the future currency and global issues. That will be our next topic we're going to look at for there. So the blockchain people who are in the studio audience here are happy to hear that. Okay. So with that, thank you so much. You have been a wonderful audience. For all those people who are sitting online who deliberately didn't put themselves off mute and go and start up a chainsaw, I thank you. For our studio audience, thanks for joining us tonight. We look forward to seeing you in the new year with new topics. And for everyone else, please have a safe evening. Please don't stop helping the Australian Computer Society to bring to the fore the key thought leadership issues that bug us and keep us awake at night. Thank you so much. You're welcome for joining us. We look forward to seeing you the next time. Thank you and good night.
Thank you.
And we are clear. Thanks, folks.